There's a pattern that has destroyed 3 countries in the last 30 years, and right now in 2025, the United Kingdom is following that exact same pattern, stage by stage, policy by policy, almost like we're reading from the same script that led to catastrophe every single time before. In 1991, Cuba could feed itself. They had agriculture, production, stability. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. The imports stopped. Within 18 months, Cubans were starving in the streets. The average citizen lost 20 pounds, not from dieting, from hunger. In 2014, Venezuela had the largest oil reserves on Earth. They could import anything. Food was cheap and abundant. Within 4 years, people were eating from bins, hunting cats and dogs, queuing for hours for a loaf of bread. In 2022, Sri Lanka had a functioning food system. Then the government made one policy decision, one change. Within months, the entire agricultural system collapsed. The government was overthrown. The country defaulted. 3 times, 3 countries, 3 complete food system failures, all following the exact same sequence. And here's what should terrify you. The United Kingdom has already completed 4 of the 7 stages. We're not approaching the pattern, we're deep inside it. Britain used to feed the world. The empire ran on British agriculture, exported globally. Now we can't even feed ourselves. And it's happening faster than anyone wants to admit. This is the story of how food systems die, why governments always think they're different, and why the mathematics say we're next. Before we go through the pattern, you need to understand what food system collapse actually looks like. Food system collapse doesn't start with empty shelves. It starts with dependency. Your food security, once guaranteed by your own land, becomes dependent on other countries' willingness to sell to you. Your agricultural knowledge, once passed down through generations, is gone. Your ability to respond to crisis, once flexible and local, becomes impossible. That's not theoretical. That's what happened to Cuba, Venezuela, and Sri Lanka. And it happened because they made exactly the same decisions we're making now. They believed food security was about money, not production. They stopped valuing farmers. They imported instead of growing, and they refused to accept reality until collapse was already underway. Let's look at how it actually happened. 3 times, the exact same way. Cuba in 1990 wasn't self-sufficient, but it was stable. They imported food from the Soviet Union. Wheat, rice, cooking oil, fertilizer, everything. In exchange, they exported sugar. The system worked because it was guaranteed. The Soviets needed an ally in the Caribbean. Cuba needed food. Everyone was fed. Then, December 1991, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Overnight, 80% of Cuba's imports vanished. The ships stopped coming. The food disappeared.
Stage 1. Import dependency. Cuba was importing 50% of their calories. They thought that was fine because imports were reliable, until they weren't. Within months, food rationing began. The average Cuban calorie intake dropped from 3,000 per day to 1,800. That's starvation level. The average citizen lost 20 pounds in 1 year. Stage 2. Agricultural collapse. Here's what people don't understand. Cuba had farmland. They had soil, climate, water, everything you need to grow food. But they'd stopped. Why bother when Soviet imports were cheaper? When the imports stopped, they couldn't just start farming again. The knowledge was gone. The equipment was sold. The young people had moved to cities. The fertilizers and pesticides they depended on were imported. Everything had to be rebuilt from scratch. Stage 3. Supply chain failure. By 1992, Havana had rolling blackouts. No electricity meant no refrigeration. Fresh food rotted before it could be distributed. The transportation network depended on imported fuel that wasn't coming. Even the food they could grow couldn't reach the cities.
Stage 4. Social breakdown. Crime exploded. The government legalized small private farms in desperation, anything to produce food. Tourist hotels had food, while Cubans starved. You could see the inequality walking down the street: well-fed foreigners, skeletal locals. Stage 5. Nutrition crisis. Vitamin deficiencies caused an epidemic of optical neuropathy. 50,000 Cubans went partially blind from malnutrition. Children's growth was stunted. An entire generation damaged because the food supply collapsed. Cuba eventually recovered, partially. They turned to organic farming by necessity, urban agriculture. But they never returned to pre-1991 food security. 30 years later, they still ration basic goods. That's what happens when a country depends on imports and the imports stop. Watch this. Venezuela 2014 to 2019. The oil money illusion. Venezuela in 2012 was rich. They had the largest oil reserves on earth, more than Saudi Arabia. The government used oil money to import everything: food, medicine, consumer goods. Why produce when you can buy? President Chavez nationalized farms and gave land to supporters who didn't know how to farm. Agricultural production plummeted. But nobody cared because oil money paid for imports. Then, 2014. Oil prices crashed from $100 per barrel to $30. Suddenly, Venezuela couldn't afford imports. The food supply depended entirely on foreign currency they no longer had. Stage 1. Import dependency. By 2014, Venezuela imported 70% of its food. 70%. They could have grown it. They have farmland, water, climate, but they chose imports. Stage 2. Currency collapse. When oil revenue disappeared, the bolivar became worthless. Hyperinflation hit 1 million% annually. Not a typo, 1 million%. A chicken that cost 14,000 bolivars in 2016 cost 14,600,000 bolivars in 2017. Supermarkets couldn't stock shelves because they couldn't afford imports. Farmers who still existed couldn't get seeds, fertilizer, or fuel. Everything depended on imports that weren't coming. By 2017, Venezuelans had lost an average of 24 pounds each. The Maduro diet, they called it. Not funny when you're watching your children starve. Lines for food stretched for blocks. People queued for 6, 8, 10 hours, hoping the store would have something, anything. By 2019, Venezuelans were eating from rubbish bins, hunting flamingos in zoos, slaughtering pets. This wasn't the 1800s. This was 2019, a modern country. Complete food collapse. 3 million Venezuelans fled the country, the largest refugee crisis in South American history.
Not from war, from hunger. Venezuela had everything they needed to feed themselves: land, water, climate, people. But they'd lost the ability to produce, and once that's gone, you can't just restart it. The knowledge is gone, the infrastructure is gone, the farmers are gone. Think it only happens to socialist countries. Let me show you a democracy. Sri Lanka 2022. The overnight collapse. Sri Lanka in 2021 was stable. Not rich, but functional. They grew tea, rice, vegetables. Tourism was recovering. The government was managing. Then April 2021. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa made an announcement. Sri Lanka would become the world's first fully organic nation. They banned chemical fertilizers and pesticides immediately, completely, overnight. The reasoning seemed sound. Organic is better for health, better for environment. European countries are moving that way. Why not be first? Within one harvest cycle, rice production collapsed by 20%. Tea production dropped 40%. Vegetable yields fell by half. Organic farming works, but it requires different techniques,
different soil preparation, transition periods. You can't just flip a switch from chemical to organic. Sri Lankan farmers didn't have organic fertilizer, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have time to transition. Crops failed immediately. Stage 2. Import crisis. Sri Lanka started importing rice. They'd been self-sufficient for decades. Suddenly, they needed foreign currency for basic food. But their foreign currency reserves were already low. Tourism had been hit by COVID. They were already in debt. By March 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its debt. The rupee crashed. They couldn't afford food imports anymore. Fuel shortages meant farmers couldn't transport food to cities. Power cuts meant food spoiled. The entire system broke down. Hundreds of thousands of Sri Lankans stormed the presidential palace. The president fled the country. The government collapsed. Not from corruption, not from war, from one agriculture policy decision. From ban to government overthrow, 15 months. 3 countries, 3 different political systems, 3 complete food collapses, all following the same pattern. Dependency, shock, supply failure, social breakdown. And here's what should keep you awake at night. The United Kingdom is following the exact same sequence, stage by stage. Let me show you. UK Stage 1, loss of food sovereignty. The United Kingdom produces only 60% of the food we consume. 60%. That means 40% of everything in your Tesco trolley comes from abroad. We import. 90% of our fruit, 50% of our vegetables, 25% of our meat, 80% of our cheese. We're not a small country without farmland. We have 17 million hectares of agricultural land, fertile soil, moderate climate, water, everything we need. We just stopped producing. When did this start? Slowly, over decades. In the 1980s, UK was 75% self-sufficient. By 2000, that dropped to 65%. Now, it's 60% and falling. Why? Because importing seemed cheaper. European farms had subsidies. Polish chicken cost less than British. Spanish tomatoes undercut local growers. British farms couldn't compete. They sold land to developers. Farmland became housing estates. Agricultural land dropped by 10% since 1990. And everyone said this was fine. This was efficiency. This was the global market working. Stage 1, complete. We've lost food sovereignty. Cuba was importing 50% of their food. We're importing 40%. Think about that. UK Stage 2, quality debasement. Post-Brexit, something changed. The UK diverged from EU food standards. Small changes, barely noticed, but they're accelerating. BPA in food packaging. Europe lowered the safe limit by 20,000 times. The UK still uses the 2015 standard. PFAS forever chemicals in food packaging. Europe bans them from August 2026. The UK has no restrictions. This is debasement. Not mixing copper into silver coins like Spain did, but allowing cheaper, lower standard ingredients because we no longer have to match European rules. And the trend is accelerating. Trade deal pressure from America wants chlorinated chicken, hormone-treated beef. The protections that kept standards high are weakening. We're seeing suppliers switch to cheaper ingredients. Same label, different formula. Customers don't notice because it's gradual, but if you compared a product from 2020 to the same product in 2025, the ingredients list has changed. Cheaper alternatives, lower quality. Stage 2, complete. Quality is being debased to cut costs. This is exactly what Venezuela did when oil money dried up. They couldn't afford quality anymore. Neither can we.
UK, Stage 3. Agricultural decline. Here's the part that should terrify you. British farming is collapsing. Right now. This isn't theoretical, it's happening. Since 2020, UK has lost 13,000 farms. Gone, sold, developed, ceased operation. The number of people working in agriculture has dropped 10% in 5 years. Why? Because farming in Britain is no longer profitable. The average British farm makes £40,000 profit annually. That's for 150 acres. After working 60-hour weeks, your local software developer earns more. Government subsidies that kept farms viable are being cut. Here's the nightmare scenario. A 50-year-old farmer can't make ends meet. His children don't want to farm because there's no money in it. He sells the land to a developer. 150 acres of farmland becomes 200 houses. That's happening 13,000 times and counting. And you can't reverse it. Once farmland becomes housing, it's gone forever. Once agricultural knowledge leaves a family, it doesn't come back. The average British farmer is 59 years old. Who's replacing them? Nobody. One farmer explained, "My grandfather farmed this land, my father farmed it, I'm farming it, but I'm telling my son to go to university, get a real job, because in 20 years there won't be any farmers left in Britain. We can't afford to exist." Stage 3, well underway. Agriculture is dying. Cuba could restart farming after the Soviet collapse. It was hard, but they had recent knowledge. People who remembered how. Britain is losing that knowledge. When the current generation retires, it's gone. Stage 4. Supply chain fragility. Remember 2020? COVID lockdowns, the empty shelves. Remember 2021? HGV driver shortages, the empty shelves. Remember 2022? Ukraine war, energy crisis, the empty shelves. We keep seeing the same pattern. Crisis hits, supply chains break, supermarkets can't stock basics. In 2023, Tesco, Asda, Morrisons and Sainsbury's rationed tomatoes, cucumbers and peppers. Rationed. In 2023. In Britain. Why? Because we import 50% of our vegetables. When Moroccan and Spanish harvests were bad, we had nothing. According to supply chain analysts, UK food system has zero redundancy. We operate on just-in-time delivery. Supermarkets keep 3 to 5 days of stock. That's how close we are to empty shelves at all times. In December 2024, France blocked British food imports for 48 hours over a regulatory dispute. 2 days. Within 24 hours, Tesco had gaps on shelves. That's not food security. That's fragility. Stage 4. Active. The supply chain is one shock away from failure. UK Stage 5. The nutrition crisis. Food banks were supposed to be emergency measures, temporary, for genuine crisis. In 2010, there were 61 food banks in the UK. In 2025, there are over 2,500. That's not a temporary crisis. That's permanent infrastructure for hunger, in the 6th richest country on Earth. The Trussell Trust distributed 3 million emergency food parcels in 2023. 3 million. In Britain. And here's the paradox. We have an obesity crisis and a malnutrition crisis simultaneously. How? Because cheap calories aren't nutrition. Ultra-processed food is affordable. Fresh vegetables aren't. The poor get fed but not nourished. NHS spending on obesity-related conditions, £6.5 billion annually. Diabetes, heart disease, joint problems, all diet-related. According to nutritionists, we're seeing Victorian-era deficiency diseases, rickets, scurvy, malnutrition in 2025 in children because their families can't afford fresh food. Stage 5, beginning. Nutrition crisis is here. Cuba hit this stage in 1992. 50,000 people went partially blind from malnutrition. We're not there yet, but the trajectory is clear. UK Stage 6, social breakdown. We haven't hit Stage 6 yet, but the warning signs are visible. In July 2022, Britain saw the first food riots since the 1970s. Small, contained, but they happened. People fighting over discounted food at supermarkets. The political instability is building. Every election, food prices dominate. Cost of living crisis. People making choices between heating and eating. The class divide is becoming visible. Wealthy people shop at Waitrose, buying organic, locally sourced food. Poor people shop at budget stores, buying ultra-processed, imported substitutes. Two different food systems, two different Britons. This is exactly how it starts. Social cohesion breaks down around food. The middle class squeezes down. The poor get hungrier. The wealthy get isolated. In Venezuela, by 2017, tourist hotels had food while locals starved. You could see who had dollars and who didn't. In Britain, you can see who can afford Waitrose and who's at food banks. Stage 6. Early indicators. Social breakdown around food is beginning. We're not at riots yet, not at government overthrow yet. But if we continue this trajectory, Stage 6 is inevitable. And that leads to Stage 7. Complete dependency. Stage 7 is complete food dependency. It's when you've lost the ability to feed yourself entirely, when you're at the mercy of other countries' willingness to sell to you. Cuba reached Stage 7 in 1993. They literally couldn't feed themselves. They needed international aid. Venezuela reached Stage 7 in 2019. 3 million people fled. The ones who stayed ate from bins. Sri Lanka reached Stage 7 in 2022. The government collapsed. Britain isn't there yet, but we're on the path. If we continue losing farmland at the current rate, we'll be 50% self-sufficient by 2035. That's below Cuba's level when they collapsed. If we continue depending on imports while our currency weakens, while trade relationships fracture, while climate change disrupts harvests, we're one major shock away from crisis. Once farmland is developed, once the nutrition crisis becomes permanent, it takes decades to rebuild. Cuba hasn't fully recovered 30 years later. Venezuela hasn't recovered at all. Sri Lanka is still in crisis. The pattern is mathematical. You cannot depend on imports forever. You cannot lose agricultural capacity without consequences. You cannot avoid Stage 6 and 7 once you've completed 1 through 5. The sequence is locked in. The only question is timing. Maybe we have 10 years, maybe 5, maybe less. But the pattern says collapse is coming. And when it comes, it won't be slow. It'll be sudden. A supply chain shock that triggers a currency crisis, that triggers food shortages, that trigger social breakdown. Overnight, food security becomes food crisis. 3 times it happened before. Cuba, Venezuela, Sri Lanka. The pattern says, we're next. We've completed 4 stages. We're entering Stage 5. Stages 6 and 7 are visible on the horizon. Maybe we'll find a way out. Maybe Britain can do what Cuba, Venezuela and Sri Lanka couldn't. Maybe we'll restore farmland, restart agriculture, rebuild food sovereignty. Maybe this time really is different. But the pattern says otherwise. The mathematics say otherwise. And history, which has watched food systems collapse the same way over and over, says we're about to learn the lesson the hard way.
Next time you're in Tesco and the shelves are full, remember, we're 3 to 5 days away from empty. We import 40% of everything you see. We've lost 13,000 farms. We're not producing. We're importing. We're depending. We're vulnerable. And the pattern says that's how food systems die. Which stage shocked you most? Drop a comment. And if you want to understand what happens at stage 6 and 7 before we hit them, subscribe.